Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey guys, welcome back. This is another episode of True Crime California, and we got another California murder for you guys today. Before I get into that, I just want to say that this week sucks. My city is on fire. I live in Los Angeles, and I know a lot of people who have lost their homes. A ton of people are now out of work. Shit sucks right now. It's really, really rough. Where I am, the air quality is okay, but a lot of people I know, that's not the case. I'm in the valley, I'm in Burbank. So when the fires were just starting, we were literally like in the middle of the triangle of like crazy fires. And they were able to put one out pretty quickly. And then now it's just these two, the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire, have just literally decimated the areas. And we still don't have even 50% containment on either fire. It's been a rough week. So tomorrow will be 1 week from the day that the fires broke out. I was actually on the beach in Santa Monica. I mentioned this in the last podcast. I was on the beach when we saw the fire kind of taking off in the Palisades, and we saw, police and fire racing towards the location. And obviously they didn't get there in time, or they weren't able to stop it, because we're at like almost 24,000 acres in the Palisades. Thousands of structures just completely gone. Historical structures. It's really awful. And in Altadena, which is like largely a Black populated area and an area populated with artists and people who don't have a lot of money, there's over 7,000 structures gone. Something like 11 people died. I mean, I think they're up to 16 now, I heard. It's absolutely awful. So I just want everybody to know what's going on. I went and volunteered last weekend. I donated some stuff. I'm going to keep trying to volunteer. It's really just like clearing brush, clearing debris, helping rebuild, and hopefully staving off these evil developers that want to buy up the land just like they did in Hawaii. I mean, it's not an accident that they just, in Los Angeles, announced they want to build a smart city, and now we have two areas that are completely leveled. I know that's like bordering on conspiracy theory, but at this point, like, I don't think the rich are above anything. So anyway, it's been a rough week. But let's lick our wounds and make ourselves feel better with a little true crime, shall we? This week I'm going to cover a pretty well-known case. This case is known as the barbecue murders, and we're going back to the 70s for this case. It's a pretty gnarly story. It takes place not just in California, but the murder is in California, so it counts. The murder takes place in Terra Linda, which is back in the Bay Area near San Francisco, but a little bit more northern. It's actually a district in the city of San Rafael, which is in Marin County. And yes, that is how you say it. It's spelled San Rafael, but it's pronounced San Rafael. I had a friend who worked for the mayor there, so I happen to know. It's a pretty cool spot. It's close to the ocean on both sides. I don't know if you'd call it a peninsula. I don't know what we call it, but it's really nice. It's surrounded by water, especially recently with gentrification and everything. It's really become like a very beautiful area with a lot of rich homes. And as a note, it's about 20 miles from Petaluma, which is where Polly Klaas lived at the time of her abduction. She was 2 episodes ago. So if you want to hear about her from my perspective, feel free to tune into that one. This case is interesting because it doesn't necessarily begin in Ecuador, but it takes place in part in Ecuador. And I'm going to start this case by talking about the victims first. So we have James Jim Olive, who was an army recruit when he met and married Naomi Wagner in 1944. Now, Naomi, I believe, was only about 19 at the time, and Jim was 28. Naomi had grown up in a pretty unstable household, with her mother being sent to mental hospitals starting when Naomi was about 2 years old, and having suffered from what today I believe would be called schizophrenia. They may have changed that again, but they were calling it like schizoid personality disorder or something back then, or maybe that's what they call it now. I have difficulty. My mom suffers from it, but I have a difficult time keeping up with the names. So this obviously deeply affected Naomi, as we'll see. And you can imagine how difficult this was for her, considering it was sort of like her way of life. Like, she grew up from the age of 2 seeing her mother in and out of these hospitals. And this continued until Naomi was 11 years old, which is when her mother died. And I'm sure that's very traumatic. And I do not have details on how her mother died, but I cannot imagine that it was of natural causes. She was only in her 30s. I don't have Naomi's exact date of birth, but she was born sometime in 1925. So again, in 1944, she's around 19 years old. Jim is 28, and they get married. From there, they moved around a bit, mostly because of Jim's work in both real estate and oil. Jim came from a wealthy family, and his father was a bit older when he was born. So by the time Jim and Naomi got married, his father was already in his 70s. And in fact, he died the same year that these two got married, and Jim's mother died only 5 years later. Now, she wasn't quite as old, but she was in her 60s. So I believe that in both instances, it was natural causes. Now, because the family was rich and because both of his parents died, this meant that before 30 years old, Jim had a pretty sizable inheritance, which he used to attempt to strike it rich in real estate. Now, unfortunately, this didn't pan out, and he ended up working in oil and moved to both Panama and Ecuador. And I believe that he had spent some time in those areas when he was younger, as he was fluent in Spanish. So Jim really enjoyed this time abroad. Whereas Naomi was not so happy there. She refused to learn the language. She didn't speak Spanish. And she thought that the women in the market and on the street were making fun of her, which to me sounds like the beginnings of some paranoia issues. Naomi became increasingly unhappy even as the couple moved back to the United States, and decided the way to fix this was to have a baby. Unfortunately, try as they might, the couple was unable to conceive. Fortunately, rich people also have good connections, and Jim had connections to wealthy and powerful families, including one in Virginia, where the couple was living when the teenage daughter of one of these local wealthy families became pregnant. Of course, the family did not want people to find out about the pregnancy because it would bring shame to them. So they allowed Jim and Naomi to adopt the baby girl, who they named Marlene, the day after she was born on January 16th, 1959. That's the adoption date. She was born on the 15th. Naomi, unfortunately, did not find peace or happiness with baby Marlene. And in fact, Marlene's presence seemed to bring out some underlying issues within Naomi, dealing with mental health mostly. For the first 6 months of Marlene's life, nobody was allowed to be near her without wearing a gauze mask over their face, and this included both Naomi and Jim. Now, obviously, this is very weird, but it's also super detrimental to babies to not be able to see the faces of the adults that they're interacting with, because babies use facial expressions and facial recognition to bond with people. The importance of this cannot be overstated, and not having this probably really stunted Marlene's emotional growth right off the bat. So she's already being traumatized and like borderline abused. And obviously, this isn't intended as abuse at this point, but it ends up kind of being that. Naomi was also a super clean freak, obsessively wiping down the house, not just daily, but like hourly. She was a stay-at-home mom, so had all the time in the world to obsess over cleanliness, and Jim worked long hours in the oil industry, so she had nobody to help her or sort of keep her grounded or really even notice like what was going on with her. When Marlene was very young, as I mentioned previously, the family moved to Ecuador. They lived there for the first 10 years of Marlene's life. So pretty much right after she was born, they moved. And so Marlene was raised bilingual. Now, again, Naomi had refused to learn Spanish, and so she wasn't able to communicate with Marlene this way, which put up a barrier between them. So it was kind of like another barrier already. And in fact, as Marlene got older, whenever she was angry with her mother, which we'll see was often, she would talk to her father about it in Spanish so that Naomi couldn't understand her, which obviously, that's not going to fly. That's going to be a big fucking problem. Beyond the language barrier, which I mean, they could communicate in English, but I feel like the barrier is a great example of their relationship in general. Naomi's overbearing, obsessive behavior didn't really stop as Marlene grew up, and it definitely put a strain on their relationship. Marlene was willful even at a young age, and Naomi, generally unhappy with her life and the living situation, and likely battling fairly severe mental illness, took to heavy drinking to manage her stress. Naomi refused to go to the doctor for her mental health because she was so traumatized by her mother's experience and so terrified of ending up like her. Which, I mean, it kind of sounds like she's headed that way, but I guess her answer was to just ignore it and drink heavily, which she did daily from about the time Marlene was 10 years old. So we just have trauma on trauma on trauma, like generational trauma. Marlene kind of doesn't stand a chance. I mean, basically from the day she's born, she's dealing with this. And speaking of Marlene at age 10, this was the age at which she found her adoption paperwork, which was in her father's office one day while she was playing. She was like going through stuff and she just finds this paperwork. When she asked Jim what it meant, he did his best to explain, but Marlene was crushed. She felt, that her not getting along with Naomi was because Naomi didn't love her. And how could she when she wasn't even her own blood? Now, Jim tried to say, we do love you. We chose you. It's a sign of how much we love you, but it didn't really work. And I have to say, maybe that would have made sense to her if the situation wasn't sort of the way that it was, where it was already very contentious and just at age 10, she's already not getting along with her mom on a regular basis. Jim and Marlene always got along really well. So, this was a big blow to Marlene. Obviously, it affected her deeply, but their relationship mostly remained intact, at least at that time. The family moved back to America briefly, then back to Ecuador, as Jim kept getting fired from his marketing jobs, but also brokering high dollar deals between the companies. So I don't know if that's shady. I don't really know. There's not a ton of information about Jim specifically, but I don't get a good vibe from him. I feel like he's not a great dude. So I don't know. But the family had to move a lot as a result of whatever the hell's going on. And this includes their last move to Terra Linda in San Rafael, California. Now, as mentioned, this is in the Bay Area, and the family ended up at 353 Hibiscus Way, which is a very cute street name. And if anybody wants to look it up, that's where they were. Naomi was elated to be back in the States, but Marlene, who was 14 when they moved, definitely was not, because for her, it wasn't really being back in the States. It was being 14 years old and being shoved into a whole new culture against your will. And the only people that you have to talk to are your adoptive parents, one of whom you really don't get along with. She also wasn't used to speaking English. She had different ideas about what was cool, what was in fashion, how to conduct herself. It was basically just a horrible case of culture shock for her. And it's such a vulnerable time in her life anyway, because the teen years are tough, no matter what. If you come from a good family and you never move homes in your life, being a teenager sucks. So for her, it's just trauma on trauma on trauma. It's pretty gnarly. Part of me thinks that this would have happened anyway, but I think also as a result of the move, Naomi and Marlene start getting into worse fights, louder fights, way more, yelling, borderline getting violent. Marlene wasn't shy about her disdain for Naomi, even telling her 6th grade teacher, which was before they moved, that she hated her mom. Straight up told her teacher, "I hate my mom." Now, pretty shortly after they arrived in Terra Linda, Marlene started high school. She was definitely an outsider, and if I had to describe her using terms for the people that I grew up with, I would say that she was a goth, before goths really existed. She would walk around telling people she was a witch and made up really fantastical stories about her life before coming to Terra Linda, including saying she was once engaged to someone far older than herself. But she was really focused on being a witch, and this was really her thing. She told people she had magic, she could cast spells. So a very kind of weird, immature way of sort of presenting herself. It feels like she's a little lost, doesn't really know how to behave. And I'm not saying that people aren't really witches. I'm not saying that. Please don't be offended by that. I'm just saying that, for her, this seemed to be sort of a coping mechanism, something where she was just making things up about herself because she didn't know how to fit in. So they're two separate things. Just want to clear that up. Her other thing, beyond claiming she was a witch, was popping pills, which she had been given prescribed by a doctor. I forget exactly what it was for. She either had like stomach pain or there was something else going on, but they were essentially like narcotics. And this started a long love affair with pills for her. She sort of started to fall in with the druggy crowd at school, kids who would hang out but weren't really her friends. You know, she did have a few friends, but it was really more just about like getting high together. Marlene, of course, went from pills to weed, which is a lateral or backwards move, but you know, she went from prescribed drugs to illegal drugs. And then from there, she started taking LSD. And in fact, the first time she ever took acid, which was at school, of course, this changed the course of her life forever. This is because on this day, she met a young man 4 years older than she was named Chuck Riley. Marlene was 15 at the time, and 19-year-old Chuck was a local drug dealer, but not really a bad guy by any means. And I know that sounds weird, but it's like selling weed is definitely not like you're a bad person. You know, like people that age, especially back then, everybody was doing shit like that. You could be a bad person, but you could also be a totally normal, nice person. So I just want to call that out. They met when Chuck found Marlene being made fun of by some of the boys she was quote unquote friends with, who were fucking with her and giving her a bad acid trip for her very first time, which is super fucked up. You shouldn't do that. My friend Lisa kind of fucked with me the first time I ever took acid. She told me about it before I took it, and she's like, I won't do that to you. And then she did. It was so mean, but we're still friends and it's fine. She then took care of me and she knew when to stop. Anyway, these kids were not being nice and it was a problem. So Chuck came up and he protected her from them. And from that moment on, he was head over heels in love with her. A few days after this interaction, he brought her some weed to school, then asked her to the movies. Marlene went, but made it a double date and went home with her friend after because she really wasn't into Chuck, but everybody likes free weed. So she was down to at least hang out. Now let's talk about Charles Chuck Riley a little bit. Like I said, he was 4 years older than Marlene, born in 1955 in Marin County, which is where this takes place, and had a really rather normal childhood. His parents never divorced, they never hit him, they never really did anything to him. That being said, Chuck wasn't without his issues, including a pretty severe weight issue that he had starting at age 5. Now, by the time he was in high school, he was over 300 pounds. In addition to this sounds really mean, but he wasn't very smart. He wasn't like naturally gifted in school. He wasn't a good athlete, and he was very shy and sort of a scared type of person, like definitely a follower. When he was pretty young, because of his weight, a doctor prescribed him Dexedrine, and he started using it as speed. He then got into weed and other drugs and started selling them as well, as I have noted. He dropped out of the high school where he met Marlene, but clearly still came around to see his friends and sell them drugs. And I'm sure, like, again, the way I'm describing him makes him sound like a shitty dude, but I really think he was just sort of lost, didn't have any real ambition, and his weight and the insecurity he felt surrounding that really affected him and his ability to thrive as a person. His father was also pretty hard on him, not like mean, but always worried he'd end up in prison because he was so aimless. And it's interesting that that was his fear. And obviously we'll get there, but I'm not talking about Chuck for no reason. After dropping out of high school, Chuck worked a bunch of like part-time jobs, mostly delivering pizza or papers. He also worked as a bartender for a while and in a factory, but always was dealing drugs on the side. So now he's met Marlene, and the two of them hang out a lot because, again, he's not working full-time. He's just kind of spending his time doing whatever. And she's not into him as a boyfriend at all. Chuck knows this. And in fact, the first night they went to the movies, she threw herself at his friend, and his friend told him, but he was not discouraged from pursuing her. He was like, it's fine. I can wait her out, whatever. It also like sort of seemed like the meaner she was, the more he liked her and the more he wanted her, which is very telling, very sad, and aligns really well with who she is and who he is and kind of where the story goes. He began to believe her stories that she was in fact a witch, that she had cast a spell on him, because he was like, why am I so in love with her? You know, like he couldn't understand what it was about her, so he assumed she had cast a spell. He was like a lost puppy just following her around, doing whatever she wanted him to do. Meanwhile, things at home for Marlene were getting worse and worse. Naomi took to mocking Marlene's birth mother, calling her a whore. And during one drunken night, Naomi even paraded around naked in front of Marlene, saying, "This is what your birth mother looks like." Which I want to call out as being super ironic, as Naomi is the drunk, naked, abusive person here. But I'm sure this is very upsetting to Marlene. She's a child. This is supposed to be her mother, even though as somebody looking in from the outside can be like, this woman's insane. She's ridiculous. For Marlene, I'm sure it was extremely hurtful. That being said, Marlene gave as good as she got and could definitely dish out some abusive language. Now, at first, Jim was Switzerland. He wouldn't get involved, and he sometimes would even take Marlene's side. After a while, though, he started to shun Marlene in an attempt to keep Naomi happy, as her mental health was deteriorating rapidly by this point. This was obviously super harmful for Marlene, as Jim was sort of participating in like an emotional incest with Marlene, treating her almost like the other woman, like he had to choose Naomi over her, which is super abusive in its own way. So much more damage being done to Marlene, who's already very lost, very angry, needs connection, needs love, needs a parent, and just does not have one. Now, because of the lack of love at home, the lack of direction, the lack of parental oversight, Marlene started acting out by sleeping with boys. Lots of them, but never Chuck. Naomi found out about this and started calling her a streetwalker, accused her of being easy, being a whore, and Naomi wasn't quiet about this, with her drunken antics being known around town, to the point where Marlene's friends weren't even allowed at her house anymore, which only further alienated Marlene. So she's got nobody. Marlene would start self-harming during their fights, which were happening daily at this point. She would like bite herself, she would hit herself, and it was just really, really bad at home. And she and Chuck were getting closer and closer, and he was doing more and more of her bidding. Now, around this time, Marlene started openly telling her friends that she wanted to kill her mother, and also decided, for whatever reason, to finally give Chuck a shot at being her boyfriend. One night, they were driving around after doing drugs and hanging out, and she started fondling Chuck while he was driving his car. The next night, they had sex for the first time, and after that, it was kind of on. They were together constantly. They were having sex at least once a day, usually more, and their sex was super sadistic, with Marlene making Chuck live out really messed up fantasies. I'm not going to get into them, but they were not good. She would have him tie her up and hurt her, and she was really into it. So she's really kind of letting out all of her frustration and her sadness, and she's using Chuck to do that. Chuck was a virgin when they met, so he did whatever she told him to do. And that's not to say that he couldn't have said no. I'm just saying that the dynamic of their relationship, considering that, it's not surprising at all that this is what's going on. Marlene used the control that she had over Chuck, not only in the bedroom, but also in their everyday lives. She would threaten to break up with Chuck almost daily, anytime he didn't do something she wanted him to do. So she was very controlling, very emotional, very angry. At one point, she got Chuck a bracelet and said she had bewitched it, so anytime she wanted him, he would feel a tingling on his wrist. Now, Chuck bought into this entirely, and he said he could feel it tingling on his wrist all the time, which worked out because she always wanted him around to boss him around and make him do her bidding. So just to sort of recap, we have this really horrible home life for Marlene, a mentally ill alcoholic, adoptive mother, this sort of emotional incest situation with her adoptive father, and then we have this really one-sided, controlling relationship with this older boy who is absolutely obsessed with her. This is just a recipe for disaster. And things, of course, get worse and worse. Beyond their weird sex life, these two got really into stealing. In 1 month, in fact, they stole upwards of $6,000, and that's in 1975 money. And the way they did it was super indicative of the power dynamics of their relationship as well. Marlene would go into a store, pick out the stuff she wanted, and then send Chuck in to go steal it for her. Now, Marlene would steal some stuff too, but she basically made Chuck do the majority of it, and it was sort of a way for him to prove his love for her, and also, obviously, to keep him under control, which is really what it was all about. Now, this went on for months and months, the two of them having this crazy sex life every single day. They're together all hours of the day and night. They're only apart when Chuck has to work or Marlene's in school, and they go on these crazy, stealing sprees. It's just nuts. Finally, one day, they got caught stealing after going back to the same store twice in one day, which is super stupid, but of course they did that because they're kids and they're stupid. They were both arrested, with Chuck going to real jail because he was like 19 or 20 at that point, while 16-year-old Marlene only went to juvie until her parents could pick her up. She did have to go to court for this, and when she went to court, she had what seemed like a change of heart. She was weeping in the courtroom, apologizing to Naomi, saying that she wanted to have a good relationship with her and for them to have a normal family. Naomi took this opportunity to be as big of an asshole as she ever had been, saying she was ashamed of Marlene and couldn't trust her. Now, the police officer who had actually arrested Marlene had suggested that she stay in juvie until her court date after meeting Naomi and realizing how fucked up Marlene's home life was. She actually thought she'd have been better off staying in juvie. And Jim was like, sure, you can stay there. But then Marlene called and was like, I want to come home. And he picked her up because he was an enabler above all else. So, at this point, Jim is just fed up with Marlene. And while he had originally really liked Chuck and thought that Chuck was a good influence, this situation completely destroyed that facade, and he forbade Marlene from seeing Chuck ever again. Chuck was, of course, extremely distraught over this and came to the house to try to talk to Jim, and Jim told him if he ever came back to the house, he would kill him. Which is so stupid to me. Like, these people are all so out of control. Like, these are two adults, and this is the way that they're behaving. It's insane to me. And of course, Marlene and Chuck found ways to talk, as all teens forbidden from seeing each other will do. And they stayed together, and they spent pretty much as much time together as they ever had, because of course they did. It didn't really help that Jim and Naomi pretty much ignored Marlene unless they were, like, screaming at her. They didn't really pay any attention to her, so she could just do whatever the fuck she wanted. And also, I think that they felt like she was out of control, so they just threw their hands up in the air and were like, we don't know what to do. They're just like victims, right? Now, finally, sick of everything and not being able to control Marlene, near the summer of 1975, they informed her that the following year, they would be sending her to boarding school. Which is like, why tell her that? Like, that is a threat to be cruel, to cause problems. Like, most parents I know who do this kind of thing, and I knew a lot of kids that were subjected to this at a younger age, would sort of spring it on the kids because otherwise it just creates more problems. Why are you going to tell your kid who is completely out of control, who hates you, 3 months ahead of time that you're sending them away? Like, all that's going to do is give them the opportunity to run away, to cause more problems. But, like, they seem to like having problems, this family, like, pretty clearly. Like, these people did not know how to behave. Now, of course, Marlene was extremely upset about this and continued to tell anybody who would listen that she wanted to kill her parents, or sometimes she would just say she wanted to kill her mother, or Naomi. She obviously said this to Chuck all the time, but it wasn't until he realized that Marlene was going to be sent away to boarding school and therefore removed from his life that he really started to sort of take her seriously and even consider being a part of the murder of her mother or parents. So, Marlene and her mother had yet another fight, this time on June 21st, 1975, and it was a really, really bad fight. Naomi came downstairs already wasted at 10 in the morning or something, and they got in a huge fight that lasted hours, and after this, Marlene called Chuck at his friend's house where he was staying and said to him, quote, "We have to kill the bitch today." Chuck, not expecting this call exactly, had just taken acid, which is so fucking insane that is a part of this story that is like agreed upon by everyone. He was on acid when this took place. Now, Chuck owned a .22 caliber pistol, and Marlene told him to bring it to her house or she would never speak to him again. Now, again, Chuck knew Marlene was going to be sent away either way. So if he didn't do what she wanted, he was going to lose her, even if she was bluffing about never talking to him again. Because obviously, she always said to him, do what I want, or I'm breaking up with you. Do what I want or I'll never talk to you again. But the added threat of her parents actually sending her somewhere made him really think, I've got to act now. His friends who overheard the phone conversation he had said that he seemed really uncomfortable, but also upset. And they heard him say, you just have to hit her as hard as you can, harder than you've ever hit anybody before. Now, apparently he and Marlene were discussing the various ways to kill Naomi while on the phone, including poisoning her or bludgeoning her with a hammer. Finally, it was decided that Chuck would come over and wait in the bushes while Marlene got Jim out of the house somehow. Once they were gone, Chuck would go in and kill Naomi with said hammer. But he would also bring his gun just in case. Chuck, high on drugs and deeply in love, agreed and left his friend's house around 1:30 p.m. and arrived to Marlene's not long after. Naomi had gone to take a nap after the fight, likely because, she was wasted and needed to sleep it off. I mean, she definitely was wasted. So the nap was probably to sleep it off. So when Chuck finally entered the home, which took him a very long time for obvious reasons, beyond just being afraid, he's on drugs. It's gonna be difficult. But when he did enter the home, she was sound asleep in bed. He hesitated outside, like I said, but when he went in and found her, he basically was like, there she is, took a hammer and hit her on the head with it just above her left eye. This created a huge hole right above her brow bone. And this also woke Naomi up. Now, maybe not ever really fully, because Chuck said that she basically just started gasping for air and flailing around. He then hit her again, this time with the sharp side of the hammer, which got stuck in her head. When Chuck talked about this later, he admitted that he had trouble pulling it out, and that during this time, his gun slipped out of his pants, hit the floor, and went off, almost shooting him in the foot. Naomi was now laid out in bed, gurgling but still alive. Chuck said he then tried to smother Naomi to put her out of her misery, but while he was doing this, Jim and Marlene arrived back home because he took way too much time to go kill Naomi. Had he gone in right after they left, he would have been long gone before they came home. But obviously, he's terrified and, again, on drugs, so this took a really long time. While outside and just before going in the house, Marlene stopped Jim in some moment of, clarity or remorse and said, quote, if you go inside, you'll die. Jim apparently laughed at this, which is super fucking weird, especially given the situation. I mean, you've got this angry daughter who you told you're sending away, who's not allowed to see her boyfriend, who does drugs. And it's just like, why would you laugh at that? Fucking weird. He then went right inside as if she hadn't said anything to him. And of course, when he did, he found both Naomi, moments from death, in bed, and Chuck standing over her with a hammer and a pillow. Jim, furious, grabbed a kitchen knife and advanced towards Chuck, who, in what he later called self-defense, pulled out his gun and shot Jim in the chest 4 times. Jim fell to the ground dead. Now get this. Marlene and Chuck then had sex in the fucking house. And I can't even tell you how often this happens when teens kill their parents. Like, it's such a thing. They kill their parents with their boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, and then they stay in the house and have sex. It's so crazy to me that this is a thing. Anyway, so after this fucked up scene, they left the house. They went to Marlene's friend's house, where Marlene was notably affectionate with Chuck, which wasn't really normal for her. Normally she wasn't into PDAs, but she was super affectionate that day, I guess, because she was rewarding him for doing her bidding, which is pretty fucking twisted. Now, when they got back to the house, which they went home later, and they realized, we have to figure out what to do with these bodies, if for no other reason than they were starting to smell. They decided to take them to a nearby campground called China Camp. Now, I don't know who knows this, but San Francisco and that area was during the building of the railroads and kind of the gold rush. It was an area where a lot of Chinese immigrants lived and worked. And in fact, Chinese immigrants built our railroads, not always by choice. In fact, not often by choice. And that's yet another smudge on the history of California and the United States. But in any case, so the Chinese lived in this area, And one of the ways that they would sustain themselves and feed their families was to go fishing. And one of the areas they did where they went fishing was this now campground that they called China Camp. Now, by the time Marlene and Chuck came to know the area, it was a lover's lane for horny teenagers. So well known by a lot of the people of their age and their type. Definitely not like a family grounds anymore, but somewhere that they could go and pretty easily hide a body. So they take the bodies there and they throw them in a barbecue pit that's at the campground. They then light them on fire. They pour gasoline and put a bunch of, leaves and shit in there. And before the fire goes out, they leave. So they don't even know if the bodies are fully burned or what, but they're like, fuck it, let's get out of here. They then go to a friend's house and, as teens always do, tell the friends they told them what they did. Like, so stupid. It's so interesting to me that, like, they're doing something so life-altering and permanently fucking crazy as murdering two people, but then they're like, I don't feel like waiting to, like, burn the bodies. Let's go hang out with our friends and let's go tell them what we did. It's like, it's this weird level of, like, supreme immaturity. And this is another thing that you see in these cases where teenagers kill people. They always tell on themselves, like 100% of the time. It's such a weird phenomenon, but it helps them get caught, I guess. So whatever. So the friend that Naomi told, like the very first friend, she actually asked if they could provide an alibi for her should the cops ever come knocking. And this friend agreed. Chuck also told friends saying they, quote, had to do it because otherwise they wouldn't be able to see each other. So this obviously wasn't going to stay a secret. After telling everybody they ever met, essentially, they ended up going back to the camp to further burn the bodies. They brought more gasoline, more wood, and they found that her parents' heads hadn't fully burned, so they had to finish the job. Now, between the time they left and the time they came back, a fireman actually found the burning bodies, but thought that they were a deer carcass and so left them. So this information only really came to light after the fact. Had this never been discovered, he probably would have gone on with his life. But the fact that obviously the two of them get caught, he then was brought to testify and talk about what he saw. Beyond that, the firefighter and all of the secrets being told, there were other challenges to staying under the radar, including Jim's boss, or I think business partner, calling to check up on him after he didn't show up to work. They were supposed to move offices, so it was pretty much immediately noticed when Jim didn't show up to do this. And after not hearing from Jim for about a week, his partner called the cops, who went to the house to do a welfare check. When they arrived, Marlene was there alone and answered the door. I think Chuck was probably at work or something. And she let the cops come inside, and they saw that her house was an insane mess. The police asked her, where are your parents? And she said, they're gone out of town. I'm not sure when they're coming back. I'm expecting them any day now. And the cops were like, that is a load of horse shit because they've been gone a week. You don't know where they are. You're not worried about them. You haven't called. And they're like, also, like, there's no way that the house would look like this if you thought your parents were coming home. You would not let your parents see the house like this. Like, no adult is going to come into this house and not freak the fuck out. So the cops were basically like, this is bullshit. And because of Jim's partner calling, cops had a pretty good idea of when Jim and potentially also Naomi disappeared. So they asked her, where were you on this day? And Marlene gladly gave them her friend's information for that alibi she'd asked for. Police kept pushing Marlene, who kept changing her story just a little bit and like just enough for them to know they were on the right track. And meanwhile, they also went and talked to her friend, who at first covered for her and apparently had also helped clean up the murder scene in the house, but pretty quickly realized this was not going to be worth the trouble and spilled the beans. Cops then went and picked up Marlene and took her to the station, where she first told them, my parents were killed by Hell's Angels, and then said, one of them killed the other one, and then disappeared. Now, it's unclear if they finally got Marlene to crack or if they used the friend's confession, but either way, they went to the barbecue pit and found the bodies, or the charred, fragmented remains of the bodies, because at this point there were only bone chips left of Jim and Naomi, which is horrifying. However, they were able to use this to arrest both Marlene and Chuck. They also found multiple letters in Marlene's room talking about killing her parents, and these letters were addressed to both Chuck and a previous boyfriend, which lent credence to the theory that she had been planning this for a very long time. One of the letters seemed to have been written after the murder and expressed her complete lack of remorse over the killings, which is just lovely. And also, again, totally something a teenager is going to do. They're going to fucking chronicle this shit in writing for the police to just like stumble upon and open and shut case, which is fine because like she's awful. Now, pretty much immediately after his arrest, Chuck made a full confession, taking all of the blame for the murders and, of course, saying he didn't remember it all that well, which is a classic murderer move. But also, in this instance, he was on acid, so I feel like this was a little bit more earnest than other confessions of a similar type. Anyway, both were charged, and before the trial started, they, of course, broke up. Marlene, I think, was upset with Chuck for killing her dad, even though she had walked Jim into his own death. I really think that she had been torn about it, which is why she took him out of the house and ultimately did not want him to die. But I think she felt that there was nothing she could do in that moment because she knew he was going to walk into the house. And she only cared about getting away from her parents. And the other thing was she and Chuck had been spending all of her parents' money since they died and were expecting to somehow get away with her parents disappearing and having her inherit their insurance money, and then they were going to move to Ecuador. So I don't think that, I mean, I think she told Chuck that she wanted her dad to die, but I really think that she was like not actually, she didn't really mean it. Like she wanted Naomi to die. She did not want Jim to die, but she was so angry. And I feel like she didn't feel like she could be honest about it, you know? So instead, she tells Chuck one thing, lets it go down the way it did, and then blames him for that. So in any case, after a short while, Marlene stopped writing Chuck back. She no longer wrote him letters. The two of them writing constantly after their arrests, but her letters started getting shorter and shorter, and then they just stopped coming. At first, Chuck was super distraught, but I think as he sort of started to get out from under her spell, quote unquote, he started to realize what was really going on. And he actually became really happy that he was no longer with Marlene. And in fact, this is so weird. At one point, he asked a guard to please let him wear the bracelet she gave him to see if he could still feel his arm tingling. He said when he put it on, he didn't feel anything. So he knew that her spell was broken. These people are insane. From here, his confession changed. He said that he, in fact, had come to the house, but had found Marlene had already mortally wounded Naomi using the hammer, and he simply attempted to smother her to help end her misery. He said Jim came in and found the two of them in the room, and he shot Jim in self-defense once Jim, caught them in the act, and that Marlene was, in fact, the real aggressor in all of this. So he said, I didn't actually kill Naomi. Marlene did. I was there, but she had already done it. And then I had to shoot Jim because he was coming at me with a knife. And I don't necessarily think that's true, but it also could be true. I mean, she was on the phone with him asking about killing her mother and then told him to come over. It's very possible that she got impatient and attacked Naomi, before Chuck ever got there. So I don't know. He supposedly made this confession while under hypnosis, but a judge later ruled that he was faking it. And the way the judge said he knew he was faking it was that Chuck was speaking in the past tense. And apparently when you're under hypnosis, you speak in the present tense only, which is a wild detail to know. Like, I didn't know that. So if somebody is being hypnotized and they aren't using present tense, you know that they're full of shit. So keep that in your back pocket, guys. Anyway, like I said, the judge did not buy it, and Chuck was found guilty of both murders. So 2 counts of murder in the first degree, and at only 20 years old, he was given the death penalty, which is pretty fucking steep. The only other thing he had on his record was that theft charge that he got from Marlene, or with Marlene, like 6 months earlier. So that's pretty gnarly. I mean, the murders were crazy, but all things considered, it feels pretty harsh. Marlene, being only 16 years old, was given 5 years, as according to state law at the time, she could only be held until her 21st birthday, despite everyone agreeing she was absolutely the mastermind behind the murders. I have to say, I do agree with not locking up children for the rest of their lives. I think that like our sort of like prison to slavery pipeline in America and especially California is pretty fucking disgusting. So while I understand that like Marlene was awful, when I look back at her life to that point and I think about the fact that she was only 16 years old, do I think she should be locked away forever? Absolutely not. And if you think that, I think you should really do some soul searching, because children are children for a reason. Biologically, your brain doesn't even stop developing until you're into your 20s. So somebody who does something like this at this age can absolutely become a different person as they get older. But we'll get there. This is not the case to sort of prove that point, unfortunately. Now for Chuck, they actually rolled back the death penalty for him. There was some sort of change in the law that basically was like, hey, that's way too fucking harsh for a 20-year-old. And I agree with that as well. And instead, they gave him 2 life sentences with the possibility for parole after, I believe, only 7 years. That being said, even though he started applying for parole at like as soon as he was able, he was denied all the way up until 2015 when he was finally released. Now, the parole board had actually granted him parole in 2011, and bitch-ass Governor Jerry fucking Brown overruled it because he was like, the crime was so brutal. And then the Supreme Court or whoever decides overruled Jerry Brown, and they were like, you have no right to do what you're doing. This guy has been rehabilitated. He's not a threat. He hasn't been a threat for years. The only infractions he has in prison are super minor. Like, just, the guy deserves to be let out. He's paid his time. He's done his time. He's paid his dues. He's not a threat. They basically said like he's a weak-minded little bitch who's learned his lesson. He's gone to college while in prison. He's been pretty much an exemplary prisoner. It's time to let him out. And so in 2015, he was released and has just sort of disappeared. He has not caused any other problems. He's just living his life. Marlene Olive, on the other hand, not so much. So Marlene gets, well, first of all, before she was released in this first stint in juvie, she escaped, and she waited until like 2 months before she was going to be released anyway and chose to escape because she just cannot make good decisions. She disappeared into, I forget where she went, like north, and she became a sex worker to support herself. After a few months, she was caught and sent back to prison where she was made to finish out her sentence. But again, they didn't add any time. They just let her go. Now, since then, she has changed her name multiple times, and she has been arrested for insane shit, like check forgery. Like, there's an article about her in the LA Times, like 15 years after her initial arrest. So she's like in her 30s. And they said that she had the most sophisticated forgery operation that the police had ever seen. She'd also changed her name a bunch of times. She engaged in sex work, theft, robbery. Like, she's just led a really horrible life of crime. Now, at this point, she's in her mid to late 60s and nobody really knows where she is. But every single point at which her location has been found or she's been reported on, it's been because she's getting arrested. It's been because she's doing something illegal. So her life definitely did not turn out in a good way whatsoever. I do hope, though, that Chuck, I mean, I know what he did was absolutely horrifying, and I don't feel like, he's a good guy here, but I do feel like the courts or the parole board got it right when they basically said he was a follower, he was totally wrapped up in this person, and he's not a threat, and he deserves another chance. 40 years in prison is a very long time, and I feel like I'm just hopeful that he is able to get his shit together and live the rest of his days in a positive way. And I think it's a good thing that he was let out. And I think honestly that these, jail times could have been reversed and it would have been a little more effective. But again, Marlene was a child. Unfortunately, she ended up going down the route that I think everybody kind of expected she would. And Charles, kind of went the way people expected he would. And I feel it was really unfortunate that he did so much time when he clearly learned from his mistakes and was no longer a threat. So I know everybody has different feelings about prison, but I borderline believe we should abolish it. I feel that there's rehabilitation, there's other options. So for something like this, 40 years is a very, very long time. But he's out now. I hope he's doing well. And yeah, that's the story. This is a fucking crazy one. Always love a good story of a teenager killing her parents. I mean, we'll never run out of those. I'll probably do quite a few more in California. There's probably quite a few. So before my time on this podcast is done, we'll have more and we can compare notes between them. But anyway, this is a really sad story. I feel for Marlene as well. I don't feel like she ever stood a chance. Like literally from the day after she was born, she was being abused and traumatized, and she didn't do anything to deserve that. She just was a victim of circumstance, and it's understandable in a way, not killing your parents, but being this angry. And I really do feel for the child, you know, for her as a child. Her as an adult, she sounds wild. My expectation is she's in Ecuador at this point, probably going to die there. I think she was much happier there. But it's interesting to think about. So if you guys want to look her up, there's definitely some more stories out there about some of the crazy shit she got into after getting out of prison or getting out of juvie, whatever. Anyway, thanks so much, you guys, for listening. I'll be back again next week with a little bit more, some more crazy, fun, terrible stories. Who knows? Things are a little wild right now with the fires and people being displaced and work being crazy. So, you know, going to keep doing this to keep myself distracted, keep myself on track. If you guys have the ability to donate to people who have lost their homes, please consider doing so. I'll see about if I can post some links on my Instagram where people can donate and how they can help. Direct donations are going to be the way to go. Finding people's GoFundMes, verifying that they're, you know, real, and donating there, I think at this point is going to be what helps the most. So I'll try to find some links, at least to the people that I know, which there are quite a few, very unfortunately. So thanks everybody for listening. Please like, rate, review, share with your friends and family, and come back next week for another crazy tale. Until then, stay safe.